We are privileged this morning to have Rob Logan with us. Rob is a member of the senior staff of the U.S. National Library of Medicine within the National Institutes of Health. He's a member of the editorial boards of the Journals of Mass Media Ethics, Science Communication, and Mass Communications in Society. He was director of the Science Journalism Center at the Missouri School of Journalism before he joined NLM in 2003. Logan began his career as a science writer and news editor at several Midwestern U.S. newspapers, got a bachelor's degree from Tulane University, master's from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and a doctorate from the University of Iowa. He serves on the advisory board for the journalism department at Cal Poly, and he was a professor in the journalism department at Cal Poly. Please welcome Rob Logan.
Thank you, Kevin. It is a pleasure to return and be in your company again after 34 years. Boy, that seems like a long time. First, a word from hello. There we go. A word from my sponsor. This is the entrance to the National Library of Medicine. Note the very modest mission at the bottom of the screen. Take a look at it. I hope you can read it. We're not kidding. We actually do what's on the screen. Also, I speak for myself. I do not speak for the National Library of Medicine or the National Institutes of Health. Second, I appreciate the Hayes family's efforts to help me see Jim on May 1st. I was Jim Hayes' colleague on the Cal Poly journalism faculty from 1977 to 1980. Today I'm going to focus on a topic that became a common interest of ours in the early 1990s, or more than a decade after I left Cal Poly. The common interest we shared in the early 90s when Jim and others at Cal Poly's Brock Center for Agricultural Communication invited me to speak here may be interesting to you because it happened later in Jim's career and later in mine. The corner of journalistic and public communication integrity I'm going to address may be a little different than what you heard from us during our Cal Poly classes in the 1970s, but I think that's what this seminar may be for. Hear how things evolved beyond what you already know. I trust the idea here is to give you some new food for thought. Let me start with a story that caught Jim's attention and led to the Brock Center's invitation for me to speak here about 20 years ago. In the early 1990s, the foundation of a very large conglomerate that owned food and tobacco companies, among many other things, offered the Science Journalism Center at the University of Missouri School of Journalism that I ran at the time about $800,000 to host workshops for journalists about how to cover the risks from exposure from secondhand smoke. I briefly became a cause célèbre in the journalism world at the time because I refused the money, and Columbia Journalism Review wrote an article about my refusal. I declined because I detected the foundation did not want the workshop to focus on the core reason to have the seminar in the first place, which is what is the best evidence or weight of evidence about the health risk associated with secondhand smoke. Instead of a focus on what is the best evidence or the weight of evidence with room set aside to discuss counter-evidence and the critics of prevailing work, the foundation wanted me to give equal time to the various sides during the course of this seminar. Now, the foundation's approach would have made it difficult for attendees to discern the comparative degree or weight of evidence that suggested deleterious health risks were associated with exposure to secondhand smoke. I should add, at the time, the prevailing evidence was grounded in statistical associations, which strongly suggest, but do not prove, secondhand smoke is or is not a significant health risk. The foundation was sure eager to discuss the latter topic, which was, again, that by nature the statistical methods being used can't demonstrate causation. But the more important topic, which again was the comparative degree that the evidence at the time strongly suggested but didn't prove secondhand smoke was a significant health risk, that wasn't what they were terribly interested in having us do. The point of the story partially is, in medicine, in public health, in food and nutrition, in environmental studies, engineering, social science, or any area that's evidence-based, there usually is a reservoir of available evidence and findings. This doesn't happen always, as the current enterovirus D68 case suggests, but it happens most of the time. More importantly, Jim and I came to understand that the most socially responsible thing a journalist can do who covers these areas is to help readers, viewers, listeners, and the public understand what is evidence-based, what is not evidence-based, what may be evidence-based, or if there is a premature evidence base, and how the topic of the immediate story, whatever it is consistent or inconsistent with the prevailing best evidence or weight of evidence. To back up for a moment, Jim relished the point that the selection of a topic of a news story, deciding what's news, is a journalist's prerogative. Following Jim's lead, I never tell, ever, a journalist what is or is not news, or second-guess news gatekeeping decisions. However, in journalism about science, health, medicine, environment, and any potential human risk area, the core issue is not the decision about what is news, it is the story's contextualization that becomes vital. The contextualization is to help readers, viewers, listeners, and the public understand what is evidence-based, what is not evidence-based, what may be evidence-based, or a premature evidence-based, and how the immediate story, whatever it is consistent or inconsistent with the prevailing best evidence or weight of evidence. Fortunately, the Society of Environmental Journalists, the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and the National Association of Science Writers in the U.S. now support a similar principle. So if a story is about secondhand smoke, vaccination safety, the safety of a specific food preservative, the safety of a pesticide used in food production, the probable reasons for no rain or unusual weather trends, why adults and kids become obese or too thin, how much salt or sugar we should eat, the merits or safety of any diet plan, or literally any evidence-based topic you can think of, the principle remains the same. The heart of the story is rarely the initial assertion. The heart of the story is something far deeper. Is the initial assertion evidence-based? Or to what degree is the initial assertion evidence-based? And how the immediate assertion, whatever it is consistent or inconsistent with the prevailing best evidence or weight of evidence. The story's underlying framework, what it gives off to readers, listeners, viewers, should focus on answering those questions. Now, let me broaden the issue and tackle a much tougher question. Why is it important to contextualize in the manner I described? What's the compelling reason to contextualize? And to answer, I turn to a story I told Jim on May 1st. About 5 weeks before I last saw Jim, I heard a University of Pennsylvania pediatrician tell the Association of Healthcare Journalists about 2 deaths from meningitis B that occurred in the University of Pennsylvania's Clinical Center Hospital last spring. In both cases, the pediatrician reported the patient and their families doubted the safety of and refused to take a meningitis B preventive vaccination that was available earlier for free in the clinics of all the universities where the students attended college. The reasons why the patients and families refused was they thought the vaccine was not safe because the FDA had not approved the vaccine. Now, it's true, the FDA has not approved a meningitis B vaccine for distribution in the US. However, the families also believed this suggested the vaccine which was developed in Europe was unsafe. The pediatrician then went through the news reports about meningitis B preventive vaccinations in radio, television, newspapers, and magazines in the Philadelphia region last winter and spring, or the coverage that the students and their family members probably saw or heard. In addition, the pediatrician took another step. He also, and highly commendably, went through the communications material about hepatitis B and preventive vaccines released by local, state, and federal public health agencies, university medical centers, advocacy organizations, and pharmaceutical companies. There are a lot in the Philadelphia area that were given to news media. He also noted a few of the discussions about the vaccine on some social media outlets. In all the materials, all of them, provided by organizations to the news media, and most of the social news media discussions across the board, guess what was frequently emphasized or mentioned? The fact the FDA had not approved a hepatitis B preventive vaccine in the US for distribution. Guess that was constantly provided. Guess what was consistently missing? there was no contextualization at all of the evidence base for the meningitis B vaccine's safety. You couldn't find out about it, not just through the reporting, but all the materials that people provided to the news media. Turning now to the prevailing public impression left by all the materials given to the press, as well as news reports and some social media, the pediatrician noted the vacuum of information about the safety of the hepatitis B preventive vaccine was a shared responsibility among area public health agencies, the university clinics in the area, governmental sources, local pharmaceutical companies, the individuals on social media, as well as the press. Commendably, he did not blame medical organizations, public health agencies, social media, or the news media exclusively or one-dimensionally. Instead, he said all parties, everybody, should have behaved more responsibly. To paraphrase what he told Association of Healthcare Journalists members, I have 2 deaths of otherwise healthy young women in my hands. Please never tell me again that a lack of contextualization or disinformation, misinformation, or a vacuum of best evidence are without harmful consequences. I hope I just got to you. He went on to emphasize 3 points. First, there is direct public harm if the best evidence about a biomedical issue is not emphasized by all responsible parties. Second, the responsibility to emphasize best evidence is shared by all participants in sciences and health's mass communication, including corporate and nonprofit healthcare organizations, physicians, public health agencies, advocacy groups, bloggers, social media providers, and journalists. And third, when there is a failure in public understanding, there usually is an accompanying neglect to fulfill or perhaps understand professional ethical responsibilities to the public. I'm asked frequently to discuss the dividing line between what's legal and what's ethical, and to provide case studies that illustrate the difference. The shared responsibility to provide best evidence about scientific risks, benefits, information to the public is my enduring favorite example. In Philly last winter, it was perfectly legal for all the healthcare organizations such as hospitals and clinics, advocacy groups, public health organizations, universities, private healthcare companies, government agencies, folks on social media, and journalists to emphasize the FDA had not approved a meningitis B vaccine. But was it ethical for their public communication to stop at that point? From an ethics perspective, as it is in almost all health and science communication, the underlying issue to all participants should have been to ensure the weight of evidence of the vaccine safety was a focus of public communication. I need to emphasize the Philadelphia incident that I just described is not an isolated case. There are many other examples from around the world in the past 30 years that have been beautifully documented where a very similar scenario has occurred. I don't have time to discuss them, but each provides consistent examples of the collective failure to provide best evidence by all parties, as well as a real-world harm. Somebody died, or many people died, or somebody became catastrophically ill, or many people did, that occurred as a result of that oversight or neglect. Let's continue by further distinguishing between what's legal and what's ethical by integrating First Amendment freedoms into the discussion. Overall, I strongly defend the First Amendment rights of any healthcare organization or any group to give their side of a healthcare or scientific controversy. They're expressing their freedom and they have the legal right to do so. Many of us, fortunately, have the right to defend our organization or client. Many of us, fortunately, have the right to pitch the press as we wish. And I'm glad journalism students, grads, and news professionals in the U.S. have some degrees of freedom to decide what is news and report as they see fit. But I submit to you, the clear path to discern any communicator's internal standards of excellence, a group's and organizations of businesses and individuals' social integrity, is whether their position in public communication is accompanied by acknowledging the best evidence about the public's risk and safety. To put this another way, exercising your First Amendment rights at times is not the gold standard of ethical and social responsibility in science and health communication. Instead, what we should strive to do, and the criteria by which we should criticize all social actors in the process of science and health communication, is who is courageous enough to provide the weight of evidence and who can do this with clarity and impartiality. In closing, in science and health communication, integrity is equated with contextualization. Contextualization is associated with the guts to provide the best evidence no matter what side of the topic or institution you represent, or if you report for a general audience. Among the many ways Jim Hayes assisted me is he helped me understand the latter issues. I miss Jim terribly, as I know so many of you do. Because in addition to the fun and the good coaching he provided so unselfishly, there was a wisdom at its core. And I hope for all of his former students, friends, and families, I just explained part of that wisdom with the clarity and precision he expected from us. Kevin.
Rob, thank you very much. As we wrap up the program for this morning, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to give the audience a chance to ask some questions that may have popped up during the course of the speakers this morning. So with that in mind, we're going to ask Judy Muller and Peter King to come back up on the stage and join Rob Logan. If you have questions of any of the speakers, we'd like you to walk up here and address the question to this microphone right in front of me. And so while we're getting folks lined up, ready for that, let me go ahead and start with a quick question for Rob. How would you assess the level of responsibility and accuracy that the media has exhibited with regard to this Ebola crisis currently?
I think, Kevin, I'm going to escape your question by doing something slightly different. If the folks upstairs are ready to help me, let me show you, not tell you, okay, a website you can go to that has evidence-based information about Ebola, okay, that has links to many other things. It's coming on the screen now. And by the way, thanks to Thomas Morales for moving things around. This is on MedlinePlus.gov, which remains the most, they're independent web surveys that show that Medline Plus is the most trusted and highly regarded website in the world. The only site that beats it, actually, believe it or not, is eBay in terms of public confidence. And by the way, I find that a weird comparison, but that's another matter. Let's scroll down if we can. You can see, you can start here and get information from all across the country, around the world, that provides a basic overview. Remember, this is all non-commercial, evidence-based information. This information is written so that most people can understand it. Let's continue to scroll down. By the way, MedlinePlus.gov has more than 1,000 diseases and conditions with the same lineup. It doesn't matter what it is, what the disease and condition, and this happens to be Ebola. And you can see they actually include some of the latest news reports about it. Let's go down a little bit more. You can see information about specifically how it's diagnosed, its diagnosis and symptoms. You can see evidence-based information about its treatment. You can see related issues. By the way, let's stop here for just a second. I haven't seen one report that explains that Ebola is a hemorrhagic fever. Hemorrhagic fevers have been around for thousands of years. They include many diseases and conditions that you've heard of, including yellow fever. The difference between those and this is surprisingly slim. Let's go down a little bit further. When it says clinical trials, if you click on clinical trials, hemorrhagic fevers, guess what? I'm not asking them to do this, but if you click there, you immediately see all the clinical trials that are going around in this world about Ebola. You actually see, okay, the actual information about the clinical trial that's going on, including how much it costs and all the people who are involved in it, what it is they're trying to do. And if we go down to where it says journal articles, If you click where it says Ebola see more articles, if you click there, you would immediately be involved in a database where most of the major journals in the world report any research they've published in the last 60 years about Ebola. Backing up a step, if you've never seen this website before, I hope that this morning will be something you remember. Doesn't matter where you come from. The information about health and medicine is not a mystery. It's not the double secret probation that a lot of students used to tell me they were on when they were here, okay? The world I live in, okay, is a world of great transparency and a world where if you go to the right place, you can find the best evidence. You can find what it is that experts know. The reason to start here is most of the sites that I've described to you are written in plain English. The more you click into clinical trials, the more you click into other medical research, obviously then you're getting into professional jargon and language. But what you also gain by that is you gain the kind of perspective and understanding that you actually need. By the way, I'll say one more thing about Ebola because my colleagues at home are working on it, and I received stuff about it today. The key to understanding what the current Ebola virus is to understand its genetic signature. Does that make sense to all of you? How is the genetic signature of what's going on now in Liberia similar or different from genetic signatures of the virus that people have seen before? As soon as that is defined and understood, then intervening against it is much simpler, much more straightforward. What happens is, in the real world on real time, they take blood and other things from people who have the disease. They run a series of tests, and the tests usually take several weeks to get not to get the results, but to compare thousands and thousands of different results and ask themselves a simple question. What's the genetic signature here? Is it similar or different from what we've seen before? By the way, the same thing exactly is done when there's a new outbreak of something in the flu, when there's a new flu virus around the world. That's how people understand, okay, what's similar here, what's different. If there is something similar, great, what do we have in the past that we can use? If it's slightly different, then what might we do in order to intervene?
All right, well, this certainly speaks to Peter King's point earlier today about the hard work that's required to be prepared to cover topics like this. Plenty of material out there, plenty of opportunity for preparation. It does take hard work, but that's what responsible journalism is all about. And thanks to Rob for putting that website up there to give you an idea of some good sources of information. So anybody who has questions, again, come on up here to the microphone. Don't be shy. And while you're coming up, presumably, I'm going to go ahead and read to you several of the cards that were filled out earlier today about what does ethics mean to you, just to give you a sense of what the audience is thinking about. Delivering value for your employer as well as for the reader, short and sweet. Ethics is the study of normativity of what we ought or ought not to do in important metaphysical sense about good and evil, about studying the reasons behind ethical judgments, recognizing that there's often not a clear, definitive consensus or answer. Another example, a core value, no matter the circumstances, that one practices despite the difficulties the value may face. And here's another way of saying that, do the work even when no editor is looking. And then finally, my life has been writing fiction, so perhaps this seems to be a paradox, but fiction is worthless without truth, every bit of truth. Stories may look at truth sideways, but wham, suddenly it's there. So those are just a couple of snapshots of what people are thinking about in terms of ethics. And so we have a question.
Yes, I'm interested in your opinions about what kind of education and training students need to do the kind of technical reporting on science and risk communication that was just described.
I'm going to assume that question was for me. There are 3 or 4 universities that have taken the lead in developing programs to do this. Certainly the University of Wisconsin has. Lehigh University has done it. Obviously, Missouri has. I can't speak for what they've done the last 10 years because I haven't been there for the last 12. But I know that the steps and structures were underway. There are syllabi, there are class structures, and many other things. I'll tell you who was the key person in developing all this was Carl Sagan. It was Carl who, by the way, taught science, journalism, and communication at Cornell, who gathered a lot of us together at an earlier point of our career and encouraged us to develop seminars, materials, syllabi, do our own writing in order to provide a protocol to do this, okay? So there are role models, there are protocols.
Other questions about blurring the line between commentary and journalism, or questions about the hard work that's involved in making sure that you're prepared to cover a story in a responsible way? And we have a questioner right now.
Yes, we do. Judy, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about efforts to promote and teach news literacy, and particularly if there's some resources that you think are good for the college level.
Yes.
Thank you.
The leader in this so far has been the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook. I took their course one summer. They have a website, Center for News Literacy, that's very good. It has lesson plans for all ages. But other areas, I'm going to be co-teaching a course with a communications colleague, which has really been interesting. It's sort of like, can we do Romeo and Juliet without the death scene? Because the comm people don't talk like journalists, and we have a language barrier. So it's called, we're calling it Discover, Decode, and Design, Navigating Media and News Literacy in the Digital Age. It's a very unwieldy kind of title because she didn't want to call it news literacy, and I didn't want to call it media literacy because that implied, oh, we're going to be looking at advertising and photographs, you know. So we're combining it. This is kind of a war that's going on in universities right now. News literacy versus media, so we're going to try to combine it. But I do think that the movement it's actually stronger in the high schools and even in the grade schools right now in terms of curriculum development, of teaching students how to use critical thinking skills, the key word, develop critical thinking skills that allows them to discern what's true, what's evidence-based, the different information neighborhood they might be in, what's raw data, what's propaganda, what's advertising, what's news, what's commentary. So it's a real lesson in getting away from, well, my parents watch Fox, or my parents listen to NPR, so that's what I'm going to do. It's like, you know, tell me why. Tell me what's valid about that. Tell me why this is a good report on this subject as opposed to that one. So there's quite a bit out there. If you Google news literacy, a lot will come up. I'm using this sabbatical this semester to travel around the country to some of the better programs that are out there. MIT's got some interesting stuff going on. Emerson. I think UNC has something. University of Maryland has something. So I'm going to be visiting these colleges and sitting in on classes and just stealing their syllabi.
Other questions?
Judy, to you, but to the other panelists if they wish as well, to reflect upon the examples that you showed from CNN of Jake Tapper and Anderson Cooper, and what appears to me to be using the lens of the personal experience as being the primary tool by which we are now relating to an audience. If you could, think of the coverage that you saw from Ferguson, and I will assume that you're of a generation to remember Tom Pettit and some of those people who covered Selma.
Right.
If you could contrast the kind of reporting that we saw in that era of the civil rights movement, very turbulent time, to what we have seen more recently from Ferguson and elsewhere, and just reflect on that, please.
Well, you know, it was funny because when I was watching the Ferguson coverage, I was thinking, what if we'd had live satellite coverage from, and watch Bull Connor hose down people in the streets and turn on the dogs? What if it had been live instead of a more less passionate reporting that comes with film and time. I think it might have been different. I mean, yes, it was a different kind of style of reporting for sure. There was no, immediate emotional reaction. But I would bet you if we had cameras that were doing live streaming of those moments, you'd be sort of hard-pressed not to get a little more passion in your voice. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on what it was Kevin's question before on when people get emotional on camera. Our job is to inform the audience, and the minute you become, it's about me, you have failed that. So your job is to fight that impulse as much as you can, the way Cronkite did. But there are times. I had a friend in Rwanda covering that for ABC, and it was overwhelming at times. So I think that would have been an interesting experiment if we could go back in time and put live coverage on those moments. I think it would change.
I'll just add a little thought. There's a theory in physics that anything observed is changed because it's being observed, and I think one of the questions that's facing, especially the visual media, but since we all use everybody's visual media, is there will be questions about, and they were in the Bull Connor days questions that were raised, but they will amplify in terms of what the presence of a camera or a smartphone or something that will broadcast this moment to the world. And I'm thinking about the Iranian teenager who was shot, and the world knew about it in less than a day, how that will influence behavior. And I think there will be a whole new suite of ethical questions to be wrestled down. There's a famous passage in the Gay Talese's book, The Kingdom and the Power, which was sort of a journalistic Bible for back in the day, about how Huntley Brinkley reported one night that the only American city that had not suffered a race riot, and I think this would have been about circa 1965, was Baltimore. And the next night there was a race riot in Baltimore. True story. So I think there will be increasing numbers of thresholds to be wrestled down at programs like this and in newsrooms and other places that haven't been thought all the way through. And so it's interesting.
And one quick follow-up, Peter, on that. It wasn't the same as live streaming, but we had this situation at UC Davis a couple of years ago where the pepper spray video of the students went viral and caused a huge uproar. And assess the impact that had and how the university had to deal with that.
Well, if you would go to our website.
But nobody does.
you can find the full report. Well, there are a lot of generational points of view that come into conflict as we make this transition into this brave new world. There are people, old cops, whatnot, who say if you step back from the videos, it wasn't all that bad. And there are people who look at it differently and say this was a terrible thing. But it's the facts. We saw these people being pepper sprayed. Not a good thing. Not a necessary use of force, as the Reynoso Commission found out. The question for this group is, absent all the footage from the cell phones, and this applies to so many stories that are in public play right now, including the Ray Rice thing and the security elevator. Absent all this footage available because of cameras that otherwise would not have been put into play, excuse me, would these events see the light of day? And so, in that sense, the brave new world is a good place, because the more the truth is brought to us through whatever medium, the better the conversation is going to be. I didn't have that big of a problem with the fellow from Ferguson because he showed both ends of the street. I've seen a lot of still photography that only showed the tanks. So I think I'm wrestling toward your question, but the Davis thing, I was glad that there was video there, and there were hundreds of video things that were made available. The observed event, the event changed because it was observed. The cops probably acted a little different because they knew they were being filmed. Everybody's behavior changes when the camera's on and or the recorder is on. And it's just, if we want to talk about journalism ethics and that stuff, and you should, it's an interesting, it's the Heisenberg theory. It's an interesting point of departure in how much as observers we influence behaviors, good and bad, and what ethical and moral obligations come along with the fact that we do.
Okay, with that, I want to go ahead and thank all of our speakers from this morning.